Hello, Jean.
Hello.
Could you tell me something about the body of work that you've brought today?
Okay, so the exhibition and the work that I'm exhibiting today is called the Nep of Life, Nep being spelled N-E-P. And the Nep in textiles is a terminology that's used for the speck or the imperfection within cotton or thread. And in textiles world, it's very much about getting rid of the nep or the speck or the imperfection. So the idea around this work, in terms of the Nep of Life, is very much about the neps within our own life, the inconsistencies, the specks, the little spot, that's a smear, but accepting it as opposed to getting rid of it. So having some sense of what that is for each one of us, and whether that lies within trauma, grief, life experiences, and to think about how we hold that and in what way, but how we also work with that. So it's not about discounting it in any way, shape or form, but it's actually about accepting it and thinking about how we might then think about it, but mainly hold it. How do we hold that for ourselves? How can it inform us and enrich us, as opposed to be something that becomes incredibly troublesome at times, which can be for some people. So it is very much about it's okay for it to be out there, and it's okay for something to be dark, it's okay for something to provoke a feeling, an embodied feeling within yourself or themselves, and to think about how that can be managed or how it can be worked with, but also to give voice to something within textiles which isn't necessarily inherent within textiles. So thinking about that emotional reactive element. So in the exhibition, what I have done is deliberately put no labels up on any of the work, and that is very much about how you and what you bring as a viewer, as someone who comes and views the piece of work. What are you bringing to it? What are you projecting upon it? What is a story and narrative that belongs to you, but you've recognised within the work itself? And that's incredibly important, because it's those responses, it's those connections, it's those resonances that are really, really key in terms of life and experiences.
I've noticed that some of your pieces are sort of collections of work within one piece, like a little montage. Do they tell a story?
Some do. So, for instance, the one in the cage, it's very much about entrapment. And it's very much about thinking around that feeling of aloneness and that feeling of sadness, an extreme sadness within that as well. So sometimes some of the work that I make or I use on the basis of hearing and listening to other people's narratives and stories. So other stories that maybe I hold as a therapist for others becomes part of the work itself. And inevitably I've made the work, so there's also an essence of me within that to some degree as well. So they become stories and become narratives. The other thing that I do is I re-story objects. I find objects that intrigue me, that I'm really curious about, and I re-story them to tell something else, to give another story and another narrative to a piece of work. At times when I begin my work, I don't always know where it's going to take me. So it might be with an object that I found or an object that I'm really curious about, and allow that object to speak to me and then work with it. I also work with opposites as well, and opposition. So a lot of my materials I work with, I like working with really solidified material, something really hard, but also I like working with ephemeral material. And it's very much about how the two can meet. How can one transition into the other, but how can they form some kind of bridge and meet together? And I also think that's a really parallel process to therapy as well. How can we find a balance? But a balance that works as opposed to a balance that opposes. And part of my finding out and my way of working with that is to play with materials and push boundaries and push limits and think about where can I take this? And what could it mean? And it's very often after I've made the work that I do then step back and think about what it means, and I sit with it for a long period of time. I move away from it and I come back to it and I sit again. And as I do that, the narrative of the piece then evolves, and it's very much after it's been made as opposed to in the process itself. So I'm very much in process. A lot of the objects that are here today are objects that were going to be thrown out and abandoned. And they're objects that I've seen that I feel have a value or a purpose, and then I've actually reused them. The figurative forms in the objects themselves are all made from scratch, and they're all made from stitch. So although they might look like something else, i.e. they might look like metal, or they might look like rust, the actual internal formation of stitch, it's all stitch and it's all threads. And then there's a patination being put on them, or a media put on to stiffen the threads themselves. But all the forms are stitched forms. Generally with the figurative forms, what I tend to do as well is I sculpt in clay. So I'll do a sculptural form, and then I'll either take a cast from the form, work on top of it, or work in the mould itself, and actually think about how I can reform it with stitch.
And is the therapeutic side of your work very important to you?
It is for me. I often think work and artwork, particularly for a therapist, particularly for an art therapist, I think is really quite key. I think art can be incredibly powerful, and I think it's a sense of self-care as well. It's about how I hold something for myself, but for other people, but how I can then work with it, with materials, with forms, with thinking. It's an inherent part of me. The therapy part, the artist part, even the researcher part of late, they're all kind of crossovers, nothing separate. They're all multiple aspects of self that come together and make the story, my story, and what I see, what I notice, what I'm curious about, what I want to envisage, and what do I want to put out there as well.
Are there any artists that have had an influence on your work?
There's Kiki Smith, who I really like in terms of her work, Louise Bourgeois, her work as well. Some of Gormley's work, I actually went and saw a piece of his not so long ago, The Lonely Place on the Beach with the Pieces, and it was just more the feeling, the felt sense of it, and the actual sheer scale of it that I really, really liked. So a lot of figurative artists. I absolutely love Intaglio and Italian artists, and sculptural, architectural, really detailed Roman classical work. And it's that some of my work, it's about that fine detail and emulating that at times. Also, it's this sense of late, this sense of, I kept thinking, okay, so everybody comes to the work and thinks, oh, it's really dark, or it's got a real sense of sadness, or it's got a really emotive sense. So I went away one year and thought, okay, so I'm going to make something that's other than that darkness and that sense, something that holds a little bit more beauty. But for the life of me, trying to do that and actually having that sense of beauty didn't actually come about as much as I would have liked. But then I kind of went back and I thought, well, actually, hang on a minute, because the things that I find beautiful are the charred bits of wood, are the abandoned bits of boxes, are the things that are discarded. And actually, there's a beauty within them. And it's about accepting that beauty rather than trying to make a beauty of something. You know, and I kind of, it took me a little while to think about that, and and think around that. When I was first working as a textile artist, I was working in the print industry, so I designed swimwear prints. And it wasn't until I became an art therapist that my work changed dramatically, and it became much more figurative. And then I went on and did a year's figurative course, which felt like a real indulgence, but actually set me on this path of using the figure and sculpture and textiles. So did both elements, and that seemed really key. As soon as I trained as a therapist, my work became much more embodied, much more storied, much more personal. And that was quite a turning point with my artwork and my making and my thinking.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for listening.